What made a small village on the banks of the Tiber River become the greatest empire the world had ever seen? It all began with a dream, not of conquest at first, but of survival. Rome started as a tiny settlement in the 8th century BC, surrounded by powerful neighbors like the Etruscans, the Greeks, and the Samnites. But what set Rome apart was its relentless will to adapt, to organize, and to endure. Unlike other civilizations that rose and fell quickly, Rome built itself slowly, stone by stone, law by law, battle by battle. Rome's rise was fueled by discipline, engineering brilliance, and a unique political system that gave even common citizens a voice, at least in theory. The Roman Republic introduced concepts like elected magistrates, citizen armies, and a balance of power between the Senate and the people. These ideas created stability and unity, which allowed Rome to expand beyond Italy and into the wider Mediterranean world. The turning point came during the Punic Wars against Carthage, especially the legendary conflict with Hannibal, who crossed the Alps with elephants and nearly destroyed Rome. But instead of falling, Rome endured. It rebuilt after every defeat, learned from every enemy, and eventually crushed Carthage, becoming the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Then came Julius Caesar, a man whose ambition reshaped the destiny of Rome. His military genius expanded Roman territory to include Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium, and brought Rome to the edge of becoming an empire. After his assassination, chaos followed, until his adopted heir Augustus emerged victorious and became the first emperor. Under him, Rome entered a golden age, as the Pax Romana, a period of peace and prosperity that lasted more than 200 years. At its peak, under Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, and from Spain in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. That's an area covering over 3 million square miles, home to more than 60 million people speaking dozens of languages and practicing countless religions. Rome was not just big, it was advanced. Its roads connected distant provinces faster than any other civilization before it. Its aqueducts brought fresh water to cities where millions lived. Its laws laid the foundation for modern legal systems. Its army was unmatched in discipline and effectiveness, and its culture influenced everything from architecture to language across Europe and the Mediterranean basin. So how did this empire grow so large? Because Rome knew how to win wars, yes, but also how to govern. It granted citizenship to conquered peoples, integrated foreign gods into its pantheon, and used local leaders to help manage vast territories. This combination of force and flexibility made Rome unstoppable for centuries. The answer lies in Rome's ability to combine military might, political innovation, and cultural adaptability. It wasn't just luck or brute force. It was strategy, resilience, and vision that turned a single city into an empire that shaped the course of history. But if Rome was so powerful, so advanced, and so enduring, how could it possibly fall? How could such a mighty empire collapse, not over centuries, but in just one day? Who would win in a battle between Roman gladiators and Roman legionaries? At first glance, the question seems absurd. Both are Roman warriors, right? But dig deeper, and you'll discover two completely different kinds of fighters with totally different roles, training, weapons, and battlefield experience. Gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or volunteers who fought for entertainment in arenas. Their fights were spectacles, bloody performances meant to thrill crowds in amphitheaters like the Colosseum. Some gladiators were highly trained and respected, even becoming celebrities among the people. They used specific styles and weapons, often designed for show, as much as for combat. There were many types. The _Ricciarius with his net and trident, the heavily armed Mamillo and the fast and agile Threx Each had their own tactics and strengths. Legionaries, on the other hand, were professional soldiers, the backbone of the Roman army. They were citizens, often from humble backgrounds, who enlisted for 25 years of service. Their lives revolved around discipline, training, and strategy. Legionaries fought in tightly organized formations, like the famous _Testudo _Tortus, where shields formed an almost impenetrable wall. They carried the _Gladius a short, stabbing sword ideal for close combat, and the Pilum a heavy javelin designed to pierce enemy shields and break formations before the main clash. Now let's compare numbers. A single Roman legion typically had around 5,000 legionaries, sometimes more with support troops. In contrast, a gladiator school who trained several hundred fighters at once, but rarely did more than 50 or 60 fight at one time in the arena. So, scale-wise, legionaries outnumbered gladiators by a huge margin. In terms of training, legionaries trained daily, marching long distances, building fortifications, sparring, and practicing maneuvers. Gladiators trained too, but their focus was more on individual duels and flashy moves rather than group tactics. Legionaries didn't just know how to fight. They knew how to win wars. Equipment also tells a story. Legionaries wore segmented armor Varica segmentata carried large rectangular shields, and wore helmets designed to protect against real battlefield threats. Gladiators wore stylized armor, sometimes less protective, sometimes unique to their role in the spectacle. For example, the Ricciarius often fought lightly armored to make the match more dramatic. And then there's mindset. Legionaries were part of a team. They fought for Rome, for honor, and for survival in brutal campaigns across Europe and beyond. Gladiators fought for their lives, yes, but often alone, in front of roaring crowds, under pressure to entertain as well as survive. So imagine this, a squad of 30 legionaries, battle-hardened and organized, facing off against 30 gladiators, each skilled in personal combat, but unaccustomed to military formation fighting. Who wins? The answer is clear. The legionaries, not because gladiators weren't brave or skilled, but because they were never trained to fight as a unit, to withstand cavalry charges, or to hold a line under siege-like conditions. Legionaries were soldiers of a vast empire, forged in real wars, against real enemies. Gladiators were performers in a deadly game, heroes perhaps, but not conquerors. If Rome had the strongest walls in the ancient world, why did they fall so easily? Rome was not just an empire of laws and legions, it was also a fortress. From Hadrian's wall in Britain to the mighty Aurelian walls around the city of Rome itself, these barriers were symbols of imperial strength and permanence. But how effective were they really when compared to other defensive systems of the ancient world? Let's start with Hadrian's Wall, built under Emperor Hadrian in 122 AD. This massive structure stretched 80 miles across northern England. It wasn't just a wall. It included forts, watchtowers, and ditches designed to control movement and defend against the fierce tribes of the north. Roman soldiers manned garrisons along its length, ready to repel invaders like the Picts. The wall stood for over 150 years before being abandoned, a testament to Roman engineering. Now compare that to China's Great Wall, built centuries later, but on a much larger scale, stretching thousands of miles. The Chinese version was meant to keep out nomadic raiders from the north, especially the Xiongnu, While impressive, it often failed to stop determined invasions. Still, both walls served as psychological barriers as much as physical ones, symbols of power and control. But what about the defenses of Rome itself? The Aurelian walls, built in the late 3rd century AD under Emperor Aurelian, surrounded the city with 12 miles of stone and towers, standing 30 feet high and wide enough for soldiers to walk atop. These walls protected Rome during some of its most turbulent times. They survived numerous sieges, including those by the Visigoths and Vandals, and remained intact for centuries after the Western Empire fell. So how did such strong fortifications fail to protect the empire? Because walls are only as strong as the people who defend them. As Rome declined, the military weakened, garrisons became understaffed, supplies ran low, and local leaders lost faith in central authority. Without enough soldiers to man the walls and towers, even the best defenses became hollow symbols. And then came new kinds of warfare. Armies learned to bypass or undermine walls using siege engines, tunnels, or bribery. Some cities were betrayed from within, their gates opened by traitors or desperate citizens, hoping to avoid destruction. Even more importantly, Rome faced enemies that were no longer small bands of raiders, but entire nations on the move. The Germanic tribes, the Huns, and eventually the Goths were not just attacking borders, they were migrating, seeking land, food, and safety. No wall could hold back the tide of history once the empire began to crumble from within. The answer is simple: Rome's walls were brilliant, but they could not save a collapsing empire. Fortifications alone cannot protect a state when its army weakens, its economy fails, and its people lose hope. Rome fell not because its walls were weak, but because there was no one left to guard them. How could the richest empire in the ancient world go bankrupt? At its height, Rome controlled a vast and diverse economy. It stretched from the fertile fields of Egypt to the gold mines of Dacia, from the bustling markets of Carthage to the grain-producing provinces of North Africa. The empire's wealth funded armies, aqueducts, roads, amphitheaters, and even free bread and games for the people of Rome. But behind this prosperity were deep cracks. Let's start with agriculture, the backbone of the Roman economy. Large estates called _latifundia dominated the countryside, especially in Italy and the western provinces. These estates were worked by slaves, often captured in wars that drained resources and lives. As fewer wars meant fewer slaves, labor became more expensive and less productive. Small farmers were pushed out, cities shrank, and rural poverty grew. Trade was another pillar of Rome's wealth. Roman coins, made of silver, bronze, and gold, circulated across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. But as stability declined, so did trade. Pirates returned to the seas. Roads fell into disrepair. Merchants faced increasing dangers, and the flow of goods slowed. With less trade came fewer taxes, and with fewer taxes came a weaker government. Now let's look at currency. The Roman denarius, once a reliable coin, began losing value during the 3rd century AD. Emperors started mixing less silver into their coins to fund expensive armies and public projects. This led to inflation. Prices rose, wages couldn't keep up, and trust in money collapsed. People stopped using coins and returned to bartering, trading goods directly instead of using cash. Taxes also became a burden. To pay for allegiance, bureaucrats, and grand building projects, Rome had to squeeze more from its citizens. Farmers paid heavy levies. City officials were forced to cover costs from their own pockets. Many fled to the countryside or joined barbarian groups just to escape the tax collector. Slavery, too, hurt the economy. Because Rome relied on slave labor, it never developed machines or new technologies to increase production. Innovation stalled. Productivity stayed low. While the population grew, output didn't keep pace. And when the supply of slaves dropped after Rome stopped expanding, the entire system began to break down. In contrast, other ancient economies, like those of Athens or Carthage, were more flexible. They relied more on trade, banking, and skilled labor. Rome, however, built its wealth on conquest and exploitation, which worked only as long as expansion continued. The answer is that Rome's economy was powerful but deeply flawed. It thrived on war and slavery, ignored innovation, and failed to adapt to changing times. When expansion stopped and internal problems grew, the financial engine of the empire sputtered and died, leaving Rome unable to defend itself, feed its people, or pay its soldiers. Did abandoning the gods of Rome lead to its downfall? Religion was at the heart of Roman identity. From the early days of the Republic, Romans believed their success came from the favor of the gods. Every home had a shrine, every army carried sacred standards, and every emperor was expected to honor the divine order. But as Christianity rose, first as a persecuted sect, then as the official faith of the empire, Rome underwent a spiritual revolution that changed everything. In the beginning, Rome practiced polytheism. It borrowed gods from the Greeks, honored ancient Italian deities, and even adopted foreign cults like those of Isis and Mithras. Religion wasn't about personal belief. It was about ritual, tradition, and duty. Romans believed that neglecting the gods could bring disaster. That's why emperors like Augustus restored temples and revived old ceremonies. They saw religion as essential to social order. Then came Christianity. Starting as a small movement in the East, it spread quickly through cities, soldiers' camps, and merchant routes. Christians refused to worship the emperor or participate in traditional sacrifices, which many Romans saw as dangerous acts of defiance. For over 200 years, Christians were persecuted, thrown to wild animals, burned alive, or exiled for refusing to follow state religion. But all of this changed with Emperor Constantine. In 312 AD, before a crucial battle, he claimed to see a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "By this sign, you shall conquer." He converted, and by 330, Christianity became the favored religion of the empire. By the end of the 4th century, under Emperor Theodosius, it was the only legal religion. This shift had huge consequences. Pagan temples were closed, priests lost power, ancient traditions faded. Some Romans blamed these changes for the empire's troubles, claiming that by turning away from the gods, Rome had angered the heavens and invited disaster. But others saw Christianity as a moral force, bringing charity, unity, and purpose to a troubled world. Christianity also changed the values of Roman society. While the old religion praised strength, discipline, and military glory, Christianity emphasized humility, mercy, and the afterlife. This didn't mean Rome suddenly became weak. Far from it. Christian leaders still fought wars, built armies, and ruled with authority. But the spirit of Rome had shifted. At the same time, religious divisions grew. Different branches of Christianity argued over doctrine, sometimes violently. Heresies were condemned, bishops excommunicated, and civil unrest followed. These internal conflicts weakened unity at a time when Rome needed strong leadership more than ever. So was the rise of Christianity the reason Rome fell? Or was it simply part of a larger transformation, one that reflected deeper political, economic, and cultural shifts? The answer is complex. Christianity did not cause the fall of Rome on its own, but it did change the soul of the empire. As traditional beliefs faded and new ideologies took hold, Rome lost a unifying cultural foundation. Whether this made the empire weaker or simply marked the end of an era is something historians still debate today. How did Rome go from wise rulers like Marcus Aurelius to madmen like Caligula and Commodus? At the heart of Rome's rise was strong leadership. Men like Augustus, Trajan, and Hadrian who brought stability, expansion, and order. But as centuries passed, the quality of Roman emperors declined dramatically. Instead of wise statesmen, many became cruel dictators, paranoid despots, or simply unfit for power. Let's start with the good. The so-called 5 good emperors, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, ruled from 96 to 180 AD. They were chosen not by birthright, but by merit, often adopting their successors based on ability. These emperors led from the front, lived modestly, and governed wisely. Under them, Rome enjoyed peace, prosperity, and military success. But after Marcus Aurelius came his son, Commodus, a man more interested in gladiatorial games than governing. He declared himself a god, dressed as Hercules, and even fought in the arena. Actions that shocked the Senate and demoralized the army. His reign marked the end of the Golden Age and the beginning of chaos. What followed was a century of instability, as the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, over 25 different emperors claimed the throne, most of them murdered or overthrown within just a few years. Some lasted only months. Others tried to rule jointly, but rarely successfully. The problem wasn't just bad leaders. It was the system itself. After the death of a capable emperor, there was no clear way to choose the next ruler. Was it hereditary, military-backed, chosen by the Senate? Without rules, every succession became a gamble, sometimes leading to civil war. Emperors like Elagabalus were barely teenagers when they took power, and behaved accordingly. Others, like Maximinus Thrax, were former soldiers with no political experience. Some were brilliant generals, but terrible administrators. A few tried to reform the empire, like Diocletian, who split Rome into east and west to make it easier to govern. But even he could not stop the rot entirely. As time went on, emperors became more isolated. They moved their courts away from Rome, built new capitals like Constantinople, and surrounded themselves with luxury while the provinces suffered. The gap between the ruler and the ruled grew wider. Taxes rose, corruption spread, and the people lost faith in imperial authority. Meanwhile, the army, once the backbone of Roman strength, became a political force. Generals started placing their own candidates on the throne, often through violence. This created a cycle: weak emperor, military coup, new emperor, more instability. It was a pattern that weakened the empire from within. And when foreign invaders finally arrived at Rome's gates, there was no strong leader to unite the people or defend the city. The last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was a boy of around 15 when he was deposed in 476 AD, a symbolic end to an empire that had lost its way. The answer is simple: Rome fell because it stopped producing great leaders. When the system for choosing emperors broke down, the quality of leadership plummeted. Weak, corrupt, or insane rulers replaced wise ones, and without strong governance, the empire could not survive the pressures of war, rebellion, and decay. How could the mighty legions of Rome be defeated by tribesmen who didn't even have cities? For centuries, Rome saw itself as the pinnacle of civilization, a beacon of law, order, and military might. But outside its borders lived peoples that Romans called barbarians, Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Saxons. These were not ignorant savages, but skilled warriors with their own cultures, strategies, and reasons for clashing with Rome. At first, Rome kept these groups at bay through diplomacy, tribute, and occasional war. Some tribes even served in Roman armies, fighting alongside legionaries against other barbarians. But over time, pressure mounted. Climate changes led to poor harvests in the north. Population growth pushed tribes toward Roman lands. And most importantly, the arrival of the Huns forced many Germanic groups to seek refuge inside the empire, sometimes peacefully, sometimes by force. Let's compare the two sides. The Roman army was highly organized, disciplined, and trained in complex battlefield maneuvers. Legionaries fought in tight formations, used standardized weapons, and followed strict commands. Their fortifications, logistics, and command structure gave them an edge in large-scale warfare. The Germanic tribes, on the other hand, fought differently. They preferred open-field battles, ambush tactics, and small unit combat. They did not rely on armor or heavy shields as much as Romans did, but they made up for it with mobility, aggression, and personal bravery. Their leaders were chosen based on reputation and strength, not rank or lineage. Numbers also played a role. At its height, Rome could field hundreds of thousands of soldiers across its vast borders. But as the empire declined, recruitment became harder. Many legions were filled with non-Roman mercenaries, some loyal, others not. Meanwhile, entire tribes, tens of thousands strong, began migrating into Roman territory, not just to raid, but to settle. One of the most decisive moments came in 378 AD, when the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens faced the Gothic army at Adrianople. He underestimated the enemy, ignored advice from his generals, and rushed into battle without waiting for reinforcements. The result was catastrophic. The Roman army was crushed, and Valens himself died in the fighting. This battle marked a turning point. It showed that Rome was no longer invincible. It also proved that Germanic warriors, when united, could stand toe-to-toe with Rome's finest and win. Over the next century, more defeats followed. Alaric the Visigoth sacked Rome in 410, the first time in 800 years that the city had fallen to a foreign enemy. Then came the Vandals under Gaiseric, who captured North Africa and later sacked Rome again in 455. Finally, in 476, Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, deposed the last Western emperor, officially ending the Western Roman Empire. So how did this happen? How could a civilization that once ruled the known world fall to people without written laws, stone cities, or standing armies? Because Rome wasn't defeated by swords alone. It fell from within. Its armies weakened, its borders stretched too far, and its leadership failed. The Germanic tribes were not conquerors of a powerful state. They were inheritors of a dying one. They took what Rome could no longer protect, not because they were stronger, but because Rome had already broken. How could the most disciplined army in history fail to protect one of the greatest empires ever known? For hundreds of years, the Roman legions were unmatched. They built roads, fortified borders, and crushed every enemy that stood in their way. But by the time the Western Roman Empire fell, those same legions were shadows of their former selves, poorly trained, underfunded, and often disloyal. Let's look at how this happened. In the early days of the Republic, legionaries were citizens of farmers, craftsmen, and landowners who fought for Rome out of duty and pride. They trained constantly, marched great distances, and followed strict discipline. A full legion had around 5,000 soldiers, sometimes more with support troops, and was divided into smaller units called centuries and cohorts. But as Rome expanded, maintaining such a massive military became harder. Conquered lands brought wealth, but also new enemies and longer borders to defend. By the time of Emperor Hadrian, Rome stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, an empire so vast it was nearly impossible to protect completely. Recruitment became a problem. Fewer Roman citizens wanted to serve. The pay was low, the service long, and the risks high. To fill the ranks, generals began hiring mercenaries from conquered peoples, including Germans, Goths, and even Huns. These foreign soldiers brought new skills and tactics, but often lacked loyalty to Rome itself. Some even switched sides when offered better pay or land. Training also declined. Earlier generations of legionaries spent years mastering formations like the _testudo_, building fortifications on the battlefield, and learning how to fight in all kinds of terrain. Later armies relied more on cavalry and less on heavy infantry. Discipline weakened, desertion increased, equipment became cheaper, less standardized, and sometimes outdated. Another issue was command structure. In the Republic, generals were experienced leaders who had worked their way up through political and military ranks. But in the later empire, many emperors were chosen by the army, not by merit or experience. This led to constant infighting, generals betraying each other, legions rebelling, and civil wars breaking out more often than battles against real enemies. Logistics also broke down. Supply lines grew longer and more vulnerable. Forts along the frontier ran out of food and weapons. Garrisons were understaffed. Roads fell into disrepair. Without proper supplies, even the best trained soldiers couldn't fight effectively. And then came the final blow, the shift from offense to defense. For most of its history, Rome was a conquering power. It moved forward, absorbed new lands, and used its military to expand influence. But by the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the empire was no longer expanding. It was trying to survive. Every battle was a defensive one. Every campaign was about holding what little remained. The result: a once mighty military force collapsed under the weight of poor leadership, weak training, and internal decay. The answer is clear. Rome's army didn't fall because of one defeat. It fell because of 1,000 small failures, from recruitment issues to declining discipline, from reliance on mercenaries to poor logistics. The legions simply could not hold the empire together anymore. When the barbarians finally came, they didn't face the legendary Roman war machine. They faced an army that had already lost its will to fight. How could the eternal city fall? Not in a glorious battle, but with barely a fight. By the 5th century AD, Rome was no longer the center of power it once was. The capital had shifted east to Constantinople, where the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive for nearly 1,000 years more. Meanwhile, Rome itself had become a hollow shell of its former self, politically weakened, economically drained, and militarily vulnerable. The final blow came from a massive invasion force, but from a small army led by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. He was not a warlord like Attila the Hun, nor a conqueror like Alaric the Visigoth. He was a soldier turned leader who simply took what was left when no one else wanted it anymore. Let's go back to the year 476 AD. The Western Roman Emperor at the time was Romulus Augustulus, a boy of about 15, placed on the throne by his father, a general named Orestes. But Orestes had made enemies, especially among the Germanic mercenaries who made up much of the Roman army. When he refused to grant them land in Italy, they turned against him. Odoacer led the revolt, His forces marched on Ravenna, the de facto capital of the Western Empire, and captured the young emperor. Instead of killing him, Odoacer spared his life and sent him into exile with a pension. Then, in an act that changed history, Odoacer did something unthinkable. He declared that there would be no more Western Roman emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, stating that one ruler was enough for the entire empire. And that was it. No great battle, no heroic last stand, no fire raining down on the city, just a quiet end to an empire that had already lost its soul. But why did no one try to save Rome? Why didn't the Senate rise up? Why didn't generals rally legions to restore the empire? Because there were no legions. Because the Senate had long since lost real power. Because the people had grown used to instability, corruption, and weak leadership. Rome had been falling for decades, perhaps even centuries, and now, finally, it had stopped resisting. Odoacer ruled Italy as king, not emperor. He kept Roman laws and customs, but he answered to no Senate and no Caesar. He was the first of many barbarian kings who would rule over the ruins of the Western Empire. The answer is simple. Rome did not fall in a single day. It died slowly, over centuries, from within. By the time Odoacer arrived, there was nothing left worth defending. Its institutions were broken, its army scattered, its people exhausted. What looked like a sudden collapse was really the final breath of an empire that had been dying for a very long time. If Rome fell over 1500 years ago, why do we still talk about it as if it were alive? The fall of Rome was not the end of Rome. Not really. Its language shaped the tongues of millions. Its laws laid the foundation for modern justice. Its architecture inspired cities across the world. And its story, a tale of greatness, corruption, ambition, and collapse, continues to echo through history. Let's start with language. Latin, the tongue of Roman citizens, gave birth to the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Over 900 million people speak these languages today. Even English, a Germanic language, borrows more than half of its vocabulary from Latin. Roman law had a lasting impact too. The idea that all citizens are equal under the law, a principle many countries take for granted, came from Roman legal traditions. Concepts like innocent until proven guilty and the use of written legal codes were pioneered by Rome long before modern nations existed. Then there is architecture and engineering. The Romans built roads so well that some still exist today. Their aqueducts brought water to cities in ways that modern engineers still admire. The Dome of the Pantheon remains one of the largest unreinforced concrete domes in the world. Governments across the globe have copied Roman styles in their public buildings, from the United States Capitol to the British Museum. Even our calendars bear Rome's mark. The names of our months, January through December, come from Roman gods, emperors, and numbers. Our week structure, holidays, and civic celebrations owe much to Roman traditions. Politically, the idea of republics, governments based on elected representation rather than monarchy, drew inspiration from the Roman Republic. The founding fathers of the United States studied Roman history closely when building their new nation. They saw themselves as heirs to Roman virtue, discipline, and civic duty. But perhaps the most important legacy of Rome is the lesson it teaches us, that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to decline. Corruption, inequality, military overreach, economic mismanagement, and loss of identity can bring even the greatest civilizations to their knees. That is why we study Rome, not just to marvel at its achievements, but to learn from its mistakes, Because while Rome may have fallen in 476 AD, its shadow still looms over every modern state, every leader, and every citizen who wonders, could this happen again? The answer is clear. Rome never truly fell, it evolved. It lives on in our laws, our languages, our cities, and our ideas. And as long as we remember its rise and fall, Rome will always be with us, a warning, a model, and a mirror held up to the present.